The final question I think is the most challenging to me. And once again, I don't think I have a very concrete answer to how my or our um, research and teaching interests give insight into how we might prepare our students to the changing environment. If at all, I think I'm being taught by my students these days, and I feel as though working with them. And again, I mentioned something about collective improvisation, right? We're improvising together. And in the process, I feel as though they let me how unequipped I have been in terms of relying so much on the assumed qualities of performance and performance teaching. And perhaps this is especially so because unlike other people, maybe other researchers or teachers who have been kind of active in incorporating technology or the digital into their research or teaching, I actually come from a more sort of quote unquote conventional or traditional way of situating my research and teaching within the venue, in the workshop, in the studio, really kind of physically connecting with the bodies and so forth. Working with my students actually has, in return, prepared me better for the changing environment, I think. So with that in mind, I think a couple of stories I might be able to share is and again, I cannot stress enough the fact that these stories are also from a very culturally, socioculturally very specific context, and so and perhaps these stories are actually all connected to the issue of relationship, relationality, forms of engagement, and how we connect to one another. And with that idea, perhaps our students, my students, would be a little bit more equipped to deal with the world, even though the pandemic is over, even after the protests, etc. So I guess one story that I could share is that I've quickly realized once we've transitioned online that our students refuse to turn on their camera. 99% of the time, they do not turn on the camera. And I've kind of asked them very gently, would you be able to turn on the camera for me to see your faces and, for us to kind of engage a little better? And later I realized that they were refusing to turn on the camera, not because they were doing something else or slacking off, but really a lot of my students, especially coming from the working class background, most of them are in the very cramped small Hong Kong apartments, living with their parents, grandparents, and to turn on their video camera, to turn on their audio even, would be to expose some of the messiness of the domestic setting, their privacy, right? And so even though they're connecting from their own room, maybe their parents might call them to help with them for cooking, cleaning, some of the stuff, to work around their family home. And sometimes their parents don't really understand what they're doing in front of the laptop, right? Because again, parents assume, obviously, right, naturally you would be kind of studying and working hard when you're in classroom, right, when you're on campus. And so sort of talking to a laptop, listening to something on your laptop would automatically translate to doing online game, engaging in online gaming or watching YouTube videos. And so 99% of my students were very embarrassed to expose that. And so that was just such an aha moment for me. And I had really kind of had to rethink about, my own assumptions about the stability of everyone's kind of learning environment or the distribution of resources. Some people didn't really have a very good broadband network, so it was very hard to kind of stream something. And so in that case, I would just upload the video and then ask them to see at their convenience. And so this just shows the gap between those students who are able to kind of access all of these resources and access to a studio, access to their private space where they could kind of move around, whereas my students just didn't really have that luxury. This is all to say that this is kind of a collective learning experience for both myself and my students to rethink about, connection, but also at the same time, how this particular disruption, right? Either because of the protests or because of the pandemic, this particular disruption and continued disruption sort of continues to show and reveal and expose the social gaps between various people that have not been addressed properly in the Hong Kong context for so many years. And so in return, I think that then prepares them to be a little more aware, right? A little more sensitive to how this sort of global pandemic or protests actually affect the learning opportunities, the lack of infrastructural support for, especially for the students who are not wealthy enough or who don't really have access to resources. With that, I think my students actually did their best to adapt to the situation, even though I did say I would not like to put too much expectation, too much stress on their adaptability. I think they did their best to be able to adapt to the situation. And so that kind of leads to my second story about some of the students who did their final projects in my class this term, which was to photo document or do an audiovisual recording of their short performance and then upload it onto a blog that I had set up to create a sort of group online installation project. And one of the students who actually had gone back to a mainland Chinese city where he originally comes from because of the pandemic, he created a performance titled "Eye Contact If You Want." And this performance was loosely inspired by Marina Abramovich's performance Night Sea Crossing series and its 2010 New York MoMA adaptation, The Artist is Present, where Abramovich kind of sits at a large table across her artistic partner Ule, and then they would sit together sort of looking at one another without actually speaking. And so that kind of raises a lot of interesting points about presence, certainly, connection, relationship, the idea of communication, sharing, co-sharing, coexisting in the same space for a certain amount of duration of time, etc. And so one of my students who had gone back to the mainland Chinese city came out to the street. Actually, he sat in front of a closed store, he sat in a park, he sat on an empty roadside, he sat there at each location, he sat there for about more than 2 hours. And then he was also wearing a mask, and he was holding a cardboard sign that said, "Eye contact if you want," just like the ways in which he would mimic Marina Abramovich. Now, obviously, there was no one right around. It was a lot of Chinese cities were under lockdown, and even when they were sort of free to kind of walk around, people wouldn't necessarily be outside because of the risk associated with the pandemic. And so what the student said was that he was initially concerned and afraid of the fact that people might see him with suspicion, that people might not be able to engage him. But at the end of the day, as the performance progressed. And what he did was just he kind of sat cross-legged in a lotus position, like you would doing some sort of meditation, and then he sometimes closed his eyes, or he opened his eyes, but then he kind of stared at a distance. And what he felt as time went by was that it didn't really matter whether he actually did have physical connection or physical interaction with these people. What really mattered to him was that he was able to kind of spiritually connect with the people who were kind of passing by. And some of the things that he observed from these people, he was able to have some time to think about what they meant, and he also kind of meditated. And so obviously sort of spiritual connection, I think it's a very endearing idea, but I think what's really important from this performance that I sort of take away is the ways in which the student is able to reconsider, rethink about the ways in which we connect, the ways in which we engage with other people. And so these two stories about, my own assumption about the very sort of active, very, very uninterrupted, synchronous kind of connection online, and my student's story about sort of meditating on the street as a form of performance. But in the end, he realized that the physical connection was just really not the most important thing. I think tell me something about how, down the road, students should be able to, or we as teachers should be able to kind of prepare both ourselves and the students to kind of be adaptable, right, to the different kinds of connections and different kinds of engagement that would unfold in the future. I think that might seem as a little more abstract in terms of a particular discipline or particular sector, but I think it's also a fundamentally kind of important issue that kind of undergirds all kinds of practices. And again, because my students are not necessarily professional actors, or they don't necessarily aspire to be professional actors or dancers or performing arts majors, but they do want to do something that's related very vaguely to performing arts sector. And I think the issue of connection, right, dealing with people, building trust with people, but in a very radically different way, I think will help them eventually prepare themselves for the changing environment of this particular sector. So hopefully you found my discussion helpful. I look forward to answering your questions and also talking more about some of the salient issues that emerge from the conversation. Thank you.